The first thing Cale Marin did every morning was draw a line. He kept a piece of sharpened alloy tucked behind the water recycler, and each morning before he ate, before he checked the atmospheric readings, before he did anything at all, he dragged that thin metal edge across the inner hull of HAB Unit 7 and put one more mark in the row. 63 marks now. 63 days since the Veth Compact had assigned him this posting, which was a polite word for exile, which was a polite word for punishment for being the last human soldier left standing at the end of the Caldera campaign, which was apparently not the kind of victory anyone had wanted. He made the 64th mark and put the alloy back behind the recycler. Outside the single observation port, the surface of Myra's third moon spread away in every direction. Gray dust, gray rock, gray silence. No atmosphere, no weather. Nothing moved out there except the slow automated crawl of the helium-3 harvesters, 3 machines the size of buildings that Cale was technically responsible for monitoring, and which had never once required his attention in 64 days. The harvesters were Veth machinery. They did not break down. They did not need a human to oversee them. That was, in fact, the point. He was here because someone in the Compact's diplomatic corps had needed a warm body in a HAB unit to satisfy a joint operations clause in the Caldera Peace Accord. Humans must maintain a presence at Myra 3's extraction facility, the clause read, for a period of no less than 1 standard year. The Veth had interpreted this in the narrowest possible sense and posted Cale alone in a HAB unit with a communications array whose live uplink function had been down since day 3, which meant the only contact he got from Earth was a batch of compressed messages every 72 hours, asynchronous, delayed, impersonal, and the only contact he got from the Veth was nothing at all. He had not spoken to a living person in 64 days. The AI they'd left him was named CASS, which stood for nothing, or maybe it did and he'd stopped caring. CASS managed the HAB systems, monitored his biometrics, reminded him to eat, and occasionally displayed a small emoticon on the nearest screen to indicate her current assessment of the situation. This morning the emoticon was a small yellow circle with horizontal lines for eyes and a flat line for a mouth. "Still neutral," he said. "Your heart rate is elevated," CASS said. "You slept poorly again." "What gave it away? Was it the part where I screamed?" "You didn't scream, you spoke in your sleep. You said a name." He didn't ask which one. He knew which one. He put water on the heating coil and watched the gray surface outside and tried not to think about the message that had come in the previous night's batch. His sister. 3 paragraphs, careful and kind, telling him that the apartment on Kessel Station was ready when he got back, that she'd kept his room. That his daughter had started talking in sentences now, full sentences, subject and verb and object, and the most recent one she'd said was Daddy when. He drank his water and checked the harvesters and marked off 64 days and thought, 101 more to go. He didn't know yet that on day 65, everything would change. The transport signature appeared on the long-range scanner at 3:40 station time, which was the middle of what passed for Cale's night cycle. CASS woke him gently, the way she'd been calibrated to wake humans, a gradual increase in ambient light, then her voice, soft. "Cale, there is a vessel inbound." He was awake before she finished the sentence. Old reflex. Soldiers didn't ease out of sleep, they broke the surface. Veth. Configuration is Veth, high-caste diplomatic courier class. They are not broadcasting identification. He was already pulling on his pressure suit, ETA. 40 minutes at current deceleration. They have transmitted a docking request. And you accepted it. A pause. The emoticon on the wall screen shifted to something that looked uncertain, horizontal lines, slight downward tilt. The request came with a compact override code. I had no authority to refuse. "Right," He sealed the last ring on his suit and stood in the dim light of his HAB unit and looked at his 64 marks on the wall. Then he looked at the harvesters outside, patient as mountains. What's the diplomatic courier class carry, normally? Personnel transport, typically used for CASS stopped. For what? I have accessed compact diplomatic records. This vessel class is associated with a specific protocol. Another pause. The emoticon changed to something he'd never seen before, two small shapes, horizontal, angled down. If he had to guess, he'd say it looked embarrassed. I believe the vessel is bringing you a companion, Kale. He stared at the screen. A companion. The compact has a formal mechanism for resolving extended isolation postings when the assigned personnel are showing signs of "I'm fine" psychological stress. The mechanism is called Pairing Protocol 7. Under it, the compact may assign a second entity to a remote posting. The companion is chosen at the discretion of the compact's social integration office. And they're sending the companion now. 64 days in. I believe, CASS said, very carefully, that the companion may have been difficult to assign. The Social Integration Office has a limited pool of available entities for human postings. Meaning they scrape the bottom. I would not characterize it that way. He pulled up the vessel's transmitted documentation on the screen. The file was dense with Veth diplomatic language, layers of formal address and procedural citation, but at the center of it was a single line of plain registry text. He read it twice. Entity, secondary designation VLUN SATRAVH, House SATRA, 4th Circle. Primary designation WITHHELD by compact order. Posting, Myra 3 Extraction Facility, Joint Operations. Duration, standard posting period, remainder. 4th Circle, he said. What's 4th Circle? CASS took a moment. 4th Circle designation in Veth nobility indicates a lesser ranking within a great house. Entities in the 4th Circle are typically assigned functions considered. Another careful pause, non-essential to the house's primary lineage. They sent me someone they didn't need. That would be a reductive, but not inaccurate summary. He sat down. The vessel would dock in 38 minutes. He looked at his marks on the wall, 64 of them, and thought about the long, empty months ahead, and thought about his daughter learning to make sentences, and thought about the Caldera campaign and everything that had come after it, and felt something shift slightly in his chest. Not hope, not exactly, but a loosening of the knot that had been sitting there since day one. CASS, he said. Yes. What's 4th Circle like? Day to day, do you have records? I have access to general Veth social documentation. 4th Circle entities typically occupy themselves with ceremonial functions, limited diplomatic duties, and she stopped. And waiting, CASS said. They are very good at waiting. Kale looked out at the gray moon. Well, he said, we'll have that in common. The docking clamp engaged with a sound like a held breath finally released, and Kale stood in the airlock corridor and watched the inner seal complete its cycle, and tried to remember the last time he'd spoken to anyone who wasn't CASS. The corridor light was the flat white of working lamps, utilitarian, and it made him aware of how he looked, work-worn pressure suit, 3 days of stubble, eyes that hadn't had proper sleep since Caldera. The inner door opened. She was tall. That was the first thing, taller than he'd expected, though he didn't know why he'd expected anything. The Veth were built lean and elongated, and the one standing in his airlock corridor was no exception. Long limbs, shoulders that curved slightly forward in the Veth resting posture, skin the pale gray-blue of deep water at dawn. Her eyes were the feature that caught him. All Veth had the double iris structure, the inner ring contracting independently of the outer, and hers were a deep amber that caught the flat corridor light and made it look warmer than it was. She was wearing, of all things, a traveling cloak, Floor-length, dark cloth, practical in the way that expensive things sometimes were. She had one bag. Behind her, through the docking seal, he could see two Veth attendants in the courier's inner corridor, faces carefully blank. They were not coming through. They were leaving her here. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then one of the attendants handed her the bag through the narrowing gap of the closing seal, and the docking door shut, and they were alone. "Cale Marin," he said. His own name felt strange in his mouth after 64 days of only CASS knowing it. "I know," she said. Her standard was precise and slightly formal, the cadence of someone who had learned it academically rather than by immersion. "I was briefed." "Velun Satrave." A pause. Something moved in her expression, not hurt, not quite, but a kind of resignation so practiced it had become its own kind of armor. "Velun will suffice." He nodded. "Are you hungry?" She blinked. Both irises contracted. It was, he would come to understand, her version of surprise. Yes. The transit was long. "I have protein paste and reconstituted grain, and something that's supposed to be coffee, but isn't." Another pause. "That sounds," she said slowly, "adequate." He almost smiled. "Welcome to Myra 3. She slept in the Hab's secondary compartment, which Cale had been using as a storage room for 64 days. He moved his accumulated detritus into a corner, the extra suit parts, the stack of technical manuals he'd been reading for something to do, the small framed photograph of his daughter he'd taken off the wall because looking at it too often made the knot in his chest tighten, and cleared the bunk and changed the recycled air filter because it was the polite thing to do. She didn't thank him for it. She said good night in the formal Veth manner, a slight incline of the head, both hands open and visible, a murmured acknowledgement phrase, and closed the compartment door, and that was that. He lay in his own bunk and stared at the ceiling and listened to the Hab settle, the small sounds of recycled air and thermal expansion, and thought, 100 days. 100 more days with a Veth noblewoman who had been sent here like unclaimed cargo, who wore her composed face like a shield, who had looked around his Hab unit with the expression of someone who had expected worse and found it. He thought about what CASS had said, fourth circle, non-essential to the house's primary lineage. He wondered what that meant. He wondered why she had no live uplink documents in her transit file, no personal communications clearance, nothing that suggested anyone was waiting for her return. He was still wondering when he fell asleep. In the morning, she made the coffee. Not the reconstituted paste that came from the emergency rations packs. She had found, somewhere in the Hab's supply cabinet, a sealed packet of actual ground bean that Cale had not known existed, had probably been there since the facility was stocked by some well-meaning Veth logistics officer who had read a human preference manifest and overprovided. She had found it and ground it and done something with the heating coil that he didn't follow, and by the time he came out of the sleeping compartment, there was a cup waiting. He stood in the kitchen alcove and looked at the cup. "I found it in the third storage bay," she said, from behind a technical interface she had somehow already accessed and was reading. The inventory listed it as human stimulant beverage, dried compressed, lower preference category. I thought it might be preferable to the reconstituted option. He picked up the cup. The smell hit him, real coffee, actual honest real coffee, and something in his chest did something complicated that he didn't have words for. "Thank you," he said. She glanced up from the interface. Both irises contracted slightly. It required no meaningful effort. He sat down across from her and drank the coffee slowly and watched her read, and thought that this was going to be more interesting than he'd expected. Her function at the facility was, technically, to assist with diplomatic oversight of the Joint Operations Agreement. This meant she was supposed to review the same extraction reports Cale reviewed, file the same batch-transmitted documentation, and ensure that the compact's interests were represented in the event of any operational dispute. There were no operational disputes. The harvesters never malfunctioned. The extraction quotas were met with mechanical consistency every 17 days. There was nothing to diplomatically oversee. What she actually did was read. She had brought with her, in that single bag, enough data storage to hold a small library, and she worked through it systematically, the interface screen lighting her face in the gray early hours while Kale ran through his equipment checks. She read Veth technical documents and standard language scientific papers, and something that appeared to be a long-form historical analysis of 7 different human Veth first contact incidents, with marginal notes that she had apparently been adding to for years. "You wrote these notes," he said once, glancing at the screen when she tilted it to adjust the angle. "I studied xenosociology at the Second Compact Academy," she said, "before my posting here." "What did you study specifically?" She considered the question for a moment, head tilted slightly in the Veth gesture that meant she was deciding how much to say. "Human adaptive psychology under isolation conditions," she said finally. He looked at her, she looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved barely, just a fraction, and she looked back at her reading. "Convenient," he said. "I thought so." He laughed. It was the first time he'd laughed in 64 days, and it sounded strange and a little rusty, like something that had been stored in the wrong conditions. She looked up at the sound with both irises contracted, and something in her face that was very nearly a smile but hadn't quite made it all the way there. "CASS," Kale said to the air. "What's the current expression code for that?" The emoticon on the wall screen flickered to a small half-curve on one side only. "Ah," he said, a half-smile, "that seems right." He learned about her in pieces, the way you learn about people when there is nothing to do but exist in proximity to them. She was 34 by the Veth standard count, which translated to something like 29 by Earth reckoning, though the conversion was approximate. She had 2 older sisters, both in the first circle, both paired and producing heirs with the appropriate genetic markers that the great houses tracked like stock portfolios. She had a brother in the second circle who had done something she wouldn't specify in the service of House Satra's external interests, which Kale came to understand was the polite Veth way of saying military action. She had not been expected to produce heirs. This was not something she said directly. The Veth didn't speak directly about things like that. Their language had 17 different levels of implication for statements that touched on lineage and fertility. But he pieced it together from the edges of things she said, from the way she talked about her sister's children with a warmth that had distance in it, from the way she didn't talk about herself in relation to the future at all. Only in relation to what she had studied, and what she had read, and what she had learned. He told her about his daughter. He did it one evening without planning to, pulling the framed photograph out of the corner he'd put it in and setting it on the shared table while they were working through the month's extraction reports. Velun looked at it for a moment. "Her name is Paya," he said. "She has your coloring," Velun tilted her head, "but her eyes are different." "Her mother's eyes, he stopped. "Her mother didn't come back from the Caldera campaign. She was ground support. She was in the second wave." Velun was still looking at the photograph. After a moment she said, very quietly, "I read about the Caldera campaign, at the academy." "Then you know what the second wave was?" "Yes." She set the photograph down carefully, upright, facing outward. "I know." They worked through the extraction reports in silence after that. But when Kale got up to check the atmospheric readings, he noticed she had moved the photograph to a position where the light from the primary observation port caught it at a better angle, so the face in it was clearly visible from both seats. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Day 89 was the day the first harvester flagged an anomaly. Kale was running through the standard morning check when the alert came up. Not a malfunction exactly, more a deviation from expected behavior. a slight variance in the extraction pattern that Cass flagged as outside normal parameters. He pulled up the full diagnostic and sat with it for 20 minutes, cross-referencing the sensor data, not because he thought it was critical, but because it was something to do, and because it was the first actually interesting thing that had happened since Velun arrived. She came and looked over his shoulder without asking. He didn't mind. This had become normal. Their shared space had reconfigured itself around their habits without negotiation, the way two careful people naturally find a configuration that doesn't require constant management. The deviation is in the subsurface extraction pattern, she said, not in the machinery. That's what I think too. There's a seam shift happening here. He traced a line on the display underneath the third harvester's primary grid. Natural geological event. The harvester's adjusting, but it's reporting the adjustment wrong. The reporting protocol is calibrated for stable geology, she said. It was not designed to account for dynamic subsurface conditions. Right. It'll right itself in a few days once the seam settles, but in the meantime, we should probably flag it in the operational report. She was already pulling up the reporting interface. She wrote the technical note with the precise, careful standard of someone who had learned the language academically, each sentence exactly right, and he found himself watching her hands long-fingered, the Veth double-jointed flexibility in the wrists, moving over the keys. "You type fast," he said. "I have had 64 days of reports to practice on," she said, which was a joke. He'd come to recognize them now, the dry, precise Veth timing, the complete absence of signaling that made humans miss them entirely. And he smiled at it, and she did the half-smile back. And they filed the report together and spent the rest of the afternoon running a manual trace on the subsurface sensor array because it was interesting and they had nothing else to do. That was the day he stopped counting the marks on the wall. Not intentionally. He made the mark that morning the same as every morning, 64 plus 25, 89. But in the evening when he normally counted the total, the reflex of a man measuring out his sentence, he didn't do it. He was reading a technical paper she had recommended about Veth geological survey methods, and she was annotating her notes on human isolation psychology. And CASS had the internal temperature at the precise comfortable warmth she had quietly determined through biometric monitoring, and he didn't count. He noticed later it was the first mark he'd missed. By day 115, she was helping him with the morning checks as a matter of course. She had learned the equipment faster than he had expected, faster, he suspected, than he'd learned it himself. And she had an engineer's approach to the machinery that surprised him until she mentioned, in her lateral way, that her academic work had included field methodology training. "You can overhaul an atmospheric recycler?" he asked. "In theory, I have not had occasion to do so in practice." "Well," he said, "if the recycler breaks, we'll find out." "I am looking forward to the test," she said, and this time the half-smile made it all the way briefly to something that was simply a smile. It became a rhythm, the way rhythms do when two careful people share a limited space for long enough, not because they decide to establish one, but because the repeated proximity of two bodies and two minds naturally finds the path of least resistance. And least resistance, Cale had come to understand, was not the same thing as least effort. It took real effort to build something out of silence without rushing it, without pushing it into a shape that the situation seemed to demand, and the people inside it didn't necessarily want. They had an unspoken agreement about the mornings. He ran the technical checks while she made the coffee, and they traded places after. She reviewed the overnight harvest data while he ate, and he reviewed the communication batches while she ran her own checks on the equipment she'd taken an interest in, which was all of it. She had a methodical way of touching machinery that was almost forensic, testing tolerances, cross-referencing readings, making small notations in her own records that she kept separately from the official operational log. He asked about this once. I am building a comparative database, she said. This facility has been operational for 9 years under continuous automated management. The equipment shows stress patterns that diverge from the manufacturer's projected degradation curve in ways that suggest the environment's influence is being underestimated. You're saying the gray moon is harder on the machinery than anyone accounted for. I am saying that the absence of human maintenance has allowed certain microadaptive failures to compound. She turned from the interface with her precise, unhurried manner. In approximately 6 months, absent intervention, Harvester 2 will begin to show significant inefficiency in its primary extraction arm. Within 18 months, failure. He looked at her for a moment. They're going to send a maintenance crew in 14 months. They will be too late for Harvester 2, she said, unless the facility's operational reports flag the issue early enough to accelerate the timeline. Which hours will? She looked at him steadily. Which hours will, she agreed. He thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, not the maintenance schedule, but the hours, which she had said without emphasis, without apparent awareness that she'd said it, the way a person says something that has quietly become true without any ceremony to mark it. He wrote to his sister that night. He wrote about the geological anomaly under Harvester 3 and the subsurface sensor trace and the Veth survey methodology paper, and didn't mention Velun at all, which he noticed as he was sending the message and thought about, and decided he would explain it in the next one. The next batch arrived 48 hours later. His sister had written, "You sound different, better different but different. Are you sleeping?" He wrote back some, and yes, different, I'll explain. The explanation he eventually sent was long and took several drafts. He deleted 3 versions that started with how different she is from what I expected, because that was both true and not the point. He deleted 2 that started with I think I was wrong about what isolation means, because that was accurate but sounded like a therapy exercise. He eventually sent a version that started, "There is a person here who studies humans the way I imagine humans looked at stars before we knew what they were, with complete serious attention, from a great distance, trying to understand." His sister wrote back, "Oh. Then, when does the posting end?" "Then after another 48 hours, I'm keeping your room." He didn't hear back for 48 more hours after that. Time always moved strangely between them. Day 131. He had been at the observation port for an hour, watching nothing move, when she came and stood beside him. They did this sometimes, stood in parallel silence, looking out at the gray surface, and it had stopped feeling like isolation a long time ago. It felt now like what it was, 2 people who had both spent a great deal of time alone, and had separately learned that silence didn't need to be filled. She said, "May I ask you something?" "Yes." At Caldera, after the campaign, a pause, he could see her choosing words with the care she brought to everything. "You were the last soldier. The accounts say you held the eastern perimeter for 6 hours alone before the compact ceasefire was transmitted." He didn't answer right away. "The accounts also say," she continued, "that when the compact's mediators arrived and found you still there, you didn't know the ceasefire had been called. You had no functioning communications equipment. You had been holding a line no one had told you was no longer necessary to hold." 6.5 hours, he said, "not 6. A silence. "I read the after-action analysis," she said, "not the official one, the one your own military filed internally. They said," she stopped, "they said the thing that distinguished your survival from that of every other soldier in that perimeter was stubbornness." He looked out at the gray surface. "They meant it as a criticism." "I know," she said, "I found it remarkable." He turned and looked at her. She was still looking out the port. Both irises in that contracted state, he'd learned, meant she was thinking something she wasn't sure whether to say. "Why?" he asked. Because stubbornness implies that you chose to continue when logic suggested you should not. She paused. The Veth word for that is, she said something he couldn't reproduce, a sound with a tonal component his vocal anatomy wasn't built for. It translates, approximately, as the refusal of a thing to become what the universe intends it to become. He thought about that. Is that an insult in Veth? He asked. It is the highest form of praise, she said. We use it very rarely. She didn't look at him when she said it. She kept looking out the port. But he could see the line of her jaw, the set of her shoulders, and in both of them there was something that was not her usual composed armor. Something opened up, deliberate. A door held ajar. He turned back to the window, and they stood in parallel silence for a long time, watching the harvesters make their slow circuit of the gray moon. And somewhere in that silence, something between them shifted from the category of circumstance into the category of choice. He didn't know when it happened. That was the honest answer if anyone had asked him, which no one did, because there was no one to ask, only the two of them and CASS and the gray moon and the harvesters and the marks on the wall he had stopped counting. What he knew was this. One morning, approximately day 145, he woke up and the knot in his chest was gone. Not loosened, not shifted, gone. The thing that had been sitting there since Caldera, since the second wave, since the day he'd come back to Kessel Station, and held Paya for the first time and felt love and grief so tangled he couldn't tell one from the other. That thing was gone. In its place was something quieter, something that had the texture of ordinary morning light. He got up and drew a line on the wall, 145. He drew it and looked at it for a moment and thought, 80 more. Then he went to make coffee, because now there was coffee. She had identified a secondary supply shipment that the facility's AI had been auto-ordering and auto-storing without any human ever noticing. An entire storage bay of provisions that included 3 kilos of actual ground bean. And the coffee was always better when someone else made it. She was already awake. She was usually already awake. She slept less than he did, another edge effect of the Veth physiology. They were crepuscular by ancient biology, most alert at the transitional light periods that didn't technically exist inside an artificial hab, but which CASS had learned to simulate with lighting changes because Velun's biometrics responded to them. She had the interface up and was reading something new. She had a habit of lifting her left hand when she was focused, palm turned slightly upward, a gesture he'd asked about once, and she'd said was ancestral, some deep Veth behavioral trace from when her species had navigated by thermals, and the upturned palm was a way of feeling the air. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." She didn't look up. "There is a message in the incoming batch for you. I have not read it, but the priority flag is your sister's standard code." He pulled it up. His sister had written in short bursts the way she did when she was excited. She said your name. Not daddy when, just your name, just Kale, clear as anything. She was pointing at your picture when she said it. "I thought you should know." He sat down. He put the message down. He picked it up again. He put it down. "Good news," Velun said. It was not a question. "My daughter said my name." A silence. Then very quietly, her voice with all its careful precision, "That is the best kind of news." He nodded. He was not going to cry in front of his posting companion on day 145 of a facility posting on the gray third moon of Myra. He was absolutely not going to do that. He was a decorated soldier who had held the eastern perimeter at Caldera for 6.5 hours. He cleared his throat. "I'm going to run the morning checks," he said. "Of course," she said, and then without looking up from her reading, "Kale." He stopped. "She said it because she knows you're coming back," Velun said. "Children know things like that." He stood in the kitchen alcove for a moment, feeling the quiet, ordinary morning light of whatever had replaced the knot. "Yeah," he said, "I think that's right." He told her about Paya over the next several weeks in the way you tell someone the things that matter, incrementally, without plan, one detail at a time. The way Paya had been born 4 weeks early and how small she'd been, how the nurses at Kessel Station's medical bay had let him hold her anyway, and she'd grabbed his finger with a grip that felt like a statement. The drawings she made. The way she called CASS, who appeared on a screen in his sister's apartment through the facility's batch communications, the face lady. The way she slept with her knees tucked up and her fists closed, the precise posture of someone determined even in unconsciousness. Velun listened the way she listened to everything with her complete attention, asking occasional precise questions, building a picture from the data. He could see her doing it, the academic turn of mind that organized information into patterns, and it didn't bother him. It felt like care expressed in the language she had. In return, without ceremony, she began to talk about her house. House Satra was old, in the way Veth houses measured age, deep roots, long memory, a lineage that had survived 17 regime changes in the compact's history by being useful and adaptable and never quite essential enough to threaten anyone. Her grandmother had been second circle. Her mother had achieved first. Her sisters had married into alliances that strengthened the house's position in the compact's current political configuration. She had not. She had studied. She had written analysis papers that had been read and praised and quietly filed by the Academy's administrative structure. She had requested field postings and been assigned to ceremonial functions. She had requested active diplomatic roles and been assigned to waiting. "Why did they send you here?" he asked, one evening with the lights dimmed and the observation port dark with the moon's deep night. She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, it was in the careful, precise way of someone choosing exactly the right words. There was a medical assessment at the Academy 3 years before this posting. The results were shared with the House without my consent, which is not uncommon for Fourth Circle entities. She paused. The assessment concluded that I was unlikely to contribute to the House's lineage in the biological sense. He understood what she was saying. He took a moment with it, held it carefully. "So they needed somewhere to put you," he said. "I believe," she said, "that the Social Integration Office reviewed the list of available remote postings and selected this one because it was the farthest from the compact's central systems, and because the posting was shared with a human, which further reduced the social impact of my presence or absence." He looked at her profile in the dim light. The Veth double-iris structure caught even the faint glow of the instruments, amber deep and steady. "They made a mistake," he said. She looked at him. "I'm sorry." "Whoever made that calculation, they made a mistake." He held her gaze. "You are not interchangeable with an absence." She was still for a long moment. Then she looked away, and he could see in the line of her throat the motion of her swallowing, a very human gesture, or a very Veth one. He wasn't sure anymore if there was a difference. "No one has ever said that to me before," she said. "Then no one's been paying attention," he said, and he meant it plainly, without embellishment, the way you say a thing that is simply true. The thing he hadn't known about the Veth, the thing the xenobiology briefings had never mentioned, or had buried in footnotes no one read, was that they were not biologically certain. The medical assessment that House Satra had filed on Velun, the one that had made her Fourth Circle's problem to dispose of, was based on standard Veth reproductive biology. Standard Veth biology, tested against standard Veth conditions. What it had not accounted for was the fact that the Veth and humans, while radically different in most respects, shared certain deep evolutionary coincidences. Not genetic, nothing so clean as that, but biochemical, signaling molecules, feedback mechanisms, the cellular architecture of certain systems that had arrived through completely separate pathways at convergent solutions. CASS found the relevant research in the deep archive of the compact's xenobiological database on day 162, while running a routine health monitoring cross-reference, and reported it to Kale in the same careful tone she used for everything. "This is unusual," she said. "How unusual?" "The research was published by a compact xenobiologist 11 years ago and has been largely unread." A pause, with an emoticon that looked thoughtful. "The finding is that in approximately 7% of interspecies VETH-human proximal exposure cases meeting certain biochemical criteria, VETH individuals previously assessed as reproductively non-viable by standard VETH metrics have shown altered hormonal profiles indicating resumed viability." He stared at the screen for a long time. "CASS," he said. "Yes. Are you telling me what I think you're telling me?" "I am telling you," CASS said, "that Velun's biometric data, which I monitor for health purposes and to which she has consented, shows a hormonal profile consistent with the described phenomenon, and that the standard duration of this effect, where it occurs, is approximately 140 days of proximal exposure." He did the math, day 145, the day the knot in his chest had disappeared. "Does she know?" he asked. "Her academic specialization," CASS said, "is human adaptive psychology under isolation conditions. She is familiar with the xenobiological literature in all adjacent fields." A pause. "The emoticon I would select to describe her current internal state based on her biometrics would be this." The screen displayed something he had never seen before: a small circle, wide eyes, mouth open in something between shock and wonder. He sat down. He stayed sitting for a long time. Then he got up and went and stood in the kitchen alcove and thought about his daughter saying his name, and about Velun's hands over the keys, and about the gray moon outside and the harvesters making their patient circuit, and about the eastern perimeter at Caldera and 6.5 hours in stubbornness. He thought about the Veth word she'd told him, the refusal of a thing to become what the universe intends it to become. He went and knocked on the compartment door. "Velun." A pause. "Yes. I think we need to talk." Another pause, longer. Then CASS told you. CASS told me. The door opened. She was standing with her full composed armor on. That face that had taken him 30 days to learn was not coldness but protection. She had her hands visible, both of them, open in the Veth gesture of transparency. "I was going to tell you," she said. I needed to be certain first. I needed to understand the parameters." "How long have you known?" A pause. Day 146. He counted. She had known for 16 days. She had been carrying it alone for 16 days, which was exactly the kind of thing a person did when they had been taught their whole life that they were the one who waited, the one who occupied space without consequence, the one whose presence or absence didn't change the calculation. "Velun," he said. She was looking at him with both irises contracted. The expression he now knew meant she was thinking something she wasn't sure whether to say. "I don't know what this means," she said. "For you, for the situation, for your life after this posting. I am aware that I am a Veth Fourth Circle entity with a complicated house affiliation and no resources outside of my stipend, and a set of qualifications that the compact has consistently declined to use. And I am aware that you have a daughter and a sister waiting for you on Kessel Station, and I am aware that I have no right to." "Velun," he said her name quietly, the way you stop someone who is walking into a wall. "Stop." She stopped. "Tell me what you want," he said. "Not what you're entitled to, not what makes sense, what you want." She looked at him for a long time. In the dim light of the HAB unit, with the gray moon outside and the harvesters moving slow and patient, she looked at him with her amber eyes and her careful, precise face, and he watched her choose, consciously, deliberately, the same conscious, deliberate act she brought to everything that mattered. "I want to keep this," she said. "Whatever this is, I want," she paused. "I want to not be Fourth Circle's problem to dispose of." "You're not," he said. "You haven't been since about day 70. She looked at him. The half-smile came, and this time it didn't stop at half. They stayed in the corridor for a while after that, not in any dramatic way, just standing in the place between the compartments, in the flat light of the working lamps, talking the way people talk when the important thing has already been said, and what remains is the texture of it, the details that fill in the shape. He asked her the question he had been not asking since he'd read the research paper that morning. "Are you frightened?" he said. She considered this with her full academic rigor, which was, he had come to understand, not detachment but respect for the question, for the person asking it, for the importance of saying what was actually true. "I am uncertain," she said finally. "Frightened implies a threat. This does not feel like a threat. It feels more like—" She paused. "In Veth, we have a word for the state of standing at the edge of a place you have never been. It is not fear and it is not anticipation. It is the honest acknowledgement that you are about to become someone you have not yet met." He thought about standing at the edge of the eastern perimeter at Caldera, the ceasefire signal dead in his equipment, the world reducing itself to the next decision and the next and the next. He thought about the moment he'd held Paya for the first time, that impossible small weight, and felt himself become someone he hadn't been the moment before. "I know that word," he said. "We don't have it in standard, but I know it." She reached up and touched his face briefly, the Veth gesture of verification, of confirming presence, a thing you did with your hands when sight and sound weren't enough, and then took her hand back with her composed precision, as if she had simply needed to confirm that he was real and was now satisfied. "I think," she said, "that we have been very poorly judged." He thought about House Satra's medical circle and the social integration office, and the form that had sent her to the farthest available outpost as an administrative convenience. "Catastrophically," he agreed. "I am looking forward," she said, "to the moment they realize it." Day 225 was the last mark on the wall. He drew it and stepped back and looked at the total, 225, the full arc of the posting from first morning to last, and thought that this was the strangest inventory he had ever made of his own life. Every day was there. The early ones, when he was alone and drawing marks as a way of bearing it. The ones that blurred together when the monotony was deep. The gap where he had stopped counting and then restarted, a longer gap than he'd realized. The later ones with her, the pattern changing without him noticing until it had already changed. She was packing her bag. They were both packing their bags. The transport was 3 hours out. Not a Veth diplomatic courier this time, a joint compact Earth vessel, because the reporting period was up, and the joint operations agreement was fulfilled, and they were both going home, which meant different things for each of them and which they had talked about, carefully and completely, in the way that people who have spent a long time in a small space learning to be honest with each other talk about things. She was going back to Veth space first. She had things to resolve with House Satra, which she described with her characteristic precision as a series of conversations I am not looking forward to but am prepared for. She had documentation, xenobiological data, medical records, everything CASS had compiled, and she had the research paper that almost no one had read, and she had herself, which Kale had suggested she consider the strongest argument available. She had looked at him when he said that with both irises contracted and said, very quietly, "You have changed the way I argue." He would go to Kessel Station. He would see his daughter, who could now say his name and several other things besides, who would be 2 years and 3 months old when he arrived, who had his sister's laugh and her mother's eyes, and who had been, every difficult day of the last year, the reason he had kept drawing the marks. After Kessel Station, they had not decided. This was, he had found, the right way to approach things, not a plan but a direction. CASS displayed her final emoticon as they moved through the closing procedures. A small circle, mouth curved, lines at the edges of the eyes that indicated the expression humans called warmth. "Safe travels," she said to both of them. Thank you, CASS, Velun said. She said it with the full formal gravity the Veth brought to genuine gratitude, both hands open, the slight inclination of the head. Kale looked at the marks on the wall, 225 of them, the whole inventory of a year, and thought about everything they contained. The Caldera campaign and what came after it. The silence that had become something other than silence. A medical assessment filed without consent, and the universe it had been designed to determine, and the way the universe had declined to cooperate. He thought about stubborn things. CASS, he said, don't let anyone paint over those. A pause. I will flag them as a historical installation. He picked up his bag. The message she sent him from Veth Space came 14 weeks after they left Myra 3. It was long, by Veth communication standards. She was characteristically precise, but there was a great deal to say. She had met with the house matriarch, who was old and practical in the way that heads of ancient institutions sometimes were, more interested in outcomes than in the protocols that were supposed to lead to them. The xenobiological documentation had been reviewed by the house's medical circle. The research paper had been read, finally, by people whose opinion the compact's institutions respected. The house, she wrote, is revising certain categories. In the second paragraph, she told him about the scan. Routine, she had said to the technician, though of course it was not routine at all. CASS's data had been correct, as CASS's data generally was. The Veth technician had needed to run the results twice, not because the technology was uncertain, but because the technician was, and had looked at Velun with an expression she described in the letter as startled and reassessing. I showed them the marks on the wall, she wrote. CASS had transmitted a photograph at my request. 225 days. They asked if I had been isolated, and I said no. I was not isolated at all. In the third paragraph, I am thinking about the conversation we have not finished having, about directions and the places they lead. I believe I would like to continue it when we are in the same location again. I believe, specifically, that I would like to have it on Kessel Station, if the offer remains available. The offer remains available, he wrote back within the hour. He showed the message to his daughter. Paya looked at the screen with her mother's eyes and said, very clearly, Lady. Yes, he said, she is coming. Paya considered this with the profound seriousness of a 2-year-old confronting important information. Then she put her hand against the screen, small fingers spread against the text, and went back to her blocks. She arrived at Kessel Station on a gray Tuesday, which was the only kind of Tuesday Kessel Station knew how to have. He was at the dock with Paya on his hip, Paya, who had been told there was someone coming and had assembled her most formal expression for the occasion, which was the one where she pressed her lips together very seriously, eyes wide, taking everything in. Kale had tried to explain Velun to Paya in the days before. He had shown her the photograph CASS had taken on one of the later evenings at Myra 3. The two of them at the shared table, both bent over the same interface, Velun's face in quarter profile, Kale's hand resting near but not touching hers. His sister had seen the photograph and had said nothing for a full minute, and then had said only carefully, she's beautiful, and he'd said yes. Paya had looked at the photograph with her forensic 2-year-old attention and had said, very precisely, eyes. Yes, he'd said, different eyes, her whole people have eyes like that. Paya had looked at the photograph for another moment, and then had given it back and gone to find her blocks, satisfied. The dock was not large. Kessel Station's commercial arrivals bay was built for efficiency, not comfort. Gray metal floors, high ceilings lost in industrial light, the constant low-frequency vibration of the station's drives that you stopped noticing after the first week. Kale stood in it and thought, involuntarily, of the gray third moon of Myra, the gray surface stretching away from the observation port, the gray stillness that had turned, without his noticing, from sentence to something else entirely. He'd gotten good at gray. Velun came through the arrival gate with her single bag and her traveling cloak and her amber eyes finding him across the crowd before he'd even raised a hand to signal. She walked toward them with the Veth composed face, the practiced armor, and he watched it shift slightly as she got closer and saw Paya not break, not drop, but open, the door ajar again, the way it had been at the observation port on Myra 3. She stopped in front of them. Paya looked at her with the serious pressing lips expression for approximately 4 seconds. Then she pointed at Velun's eyes, both of them, the double iris structure, amber and deep, entirely unlike anything a 2-year-old on Kessel Station had likely encountered, and said, with great conviction, "Pretty." Velun looked at the small pointing hand, then at Kale. He shrugged. "She's not wrong." The half-smile came and went past half and kept going, and it was the first time he had seen it go all the way, and it changed her face completely, made it younger and less armored and entirely itself. He thought he could spend a considerable amount of time looking at that expression and not arrive at the end of it. Paya, satisfied with her assessment, put her hand out toward Velun with the confident expectation of a person who has never once doubted she would be received. Velun looked at the small hand. Then she took it, her long double-jointed fingers wrapping gently around the tiny ones, and held it. They stood like that in the gray arrivals bay, the 3 of them, while the station moved around them with its ordinary noise and its ordinary purpose. And Kale looked at Velun's face as she looked down at Paya, and saw the expression of someone who has been told their whole life what they are and what they are not, what they can and cannot become. Who has arrived at a moment the universe's accountants had not included in their calculations, and found it larger and stranger, and more complete than anything they had been given to expect. "Hello, Paya," Velun said. Her standard with a 2-year-old was the same as her standard with everyone, precise, careful, respectful of the listener's intelligence. Paya looked up at her with absolute seriousness. "You have 2 eyes," she said. "2 sets of irises," Velun agreed. "Is that interesting?" Paya considered. "Yes," she said, with the firm certainty of an unambiguous conclusion. Velun looked at Kale again, and the expression on her face was the one he had been storing since day 70. The one that existed beneath all the armor, that he'd glimpsed first in the corridor, and then increasingly over 150 more days. And it was still there, still the same, unchanged by the 3 months of Veth space navigation and house matriarchs and medical circles and classification reviews. "She's remarkable," Velun said. "I know," he said. "I don't know where she gets it." Paya had transferred her grip to 2 of Velun's fingers and was pulling, with great authority, in the direction of the exit. She had decided, apparently, that the arrivals bay had served its purpose and further proceedings should occur elsewhere. "She is very decisive," Velun observed, allowing herself to be directed. "She gets that from her mother," Kale said. They followed Paya's lead out of the gray bay and into the corridor beyond, where the light was slightly warmer and the ceiling lower, and the station felt, finally, like somewhere people actually lived. The report reached the Veth Compact Social Integration Office 11 months later. It was not the kind of report the Social Integration Office normally received. Most reports were routine, postings completed, entities returned to their classifications, the administrative machinery of a vast interspecies compact moving smoothly and without incident. This report was filed by the House Satra Medical Circle, countersigned by the Compact's Central Xenobiological Review Board, and routed through 3 separate administrative channels before anyone could decide whose desk it was supposed to land on. The summary was brief. It noted that a 4th circle entity of House Satra, assessed medically non-viable and assigned to a remote posting as an administrative convenience, had returned from that posting with a xenobiological outcome that the original assessment had not considered possible. It noted that the outcome was in good health, exceptional health, the board noted, the biometrics consistent with optimal development across both of the hereditary lines contributing to the profile. It noted that the research on which this outcome had been theoretically possible had been in the compact's academic database for 11 years and had not been reviewed by the Social Integration Office's Medical Advisory Panel because it had been categorized as low-relevance literature. The report recommended a review of several classification protocols. The junior administrator who received it read it twice, the way the VETH technician had read the original scan. Then they routed it upward with a flag marked urgent, and sat for a moment in the particular silence of someone who has encountered something the filing systems were not designed to contain. On Kessel Station, on a gray Tuesday that had turned unexpectedly sunny, Cale Marin was teaching his daughter to count. Paya was sitting on the floor with her blocks, and she was very serious about counting, and she got to 6 and looked up with an expression of pure concentrated effort. Velun was at the table, reading, still reading, always reading, though the notes in the margins were different now. The academic analysis of human isolation psychology that had filled the margins of her texts at Myra 3 replaced by something more personal, observations that had moved from the third person to the first. She looked up when Paya reached 6 and looked for validation. "Very good," she said. 7 is next." Paya looked at her with profound seriousness, then held up 7 fingers with great deliberate care. "Correct," Velun said. She looked at Cale. He was smiling at her. He was not going to stop. She looked back at Paya, and the half-smile that had become a full smile over the course of one gray year on a distant moon settled into something steadier and less provisional. The expression of a person who has arrived somewhere, who is no longer in transit, who has decided what the universe intends for them to become, and found the Veth word for declining to agree. 8, she said. "Show me 8. Paya showed her 8, and the sun came in through the station window at a low angle that made everything warm, and somewhere in the compact's administrative machinery, a report was working its way upward towards someone whose categories were about to require expansion. And on the inner hull of Hab Unit 7 on the gray third moon of Myra, 225 small lines remained exactly where Cale had left them, flagged as a historical installation, patient as the harvesters below. Waiting for the day, someone came to read what they said.